All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the seventh day of the webinar series of the TFOS Lifestyle Reports. Today, we'll be looking at the impact of digital environment on the ocular surface. So far, we've seen a lot about how the ocular surface can be impacted by different factors, societal challenges, environmental challenges, elective medications, and so on. And today we'll be looking at something that's very, very universal to everyone. Something that we are using right now. We're using, this is an online webinar series, and we're using digital devices to reach out to different parts of Africa. So we would like to know, how does this digital device that we use every day affect the ocular surface? I mean, it's a hot topic in myopia management. It's a hot topic by disease, and we would be looking at how this affects the ocular surface. And I mean, our speaker today is actually the best person to talk about this. Professor James is a well-known, well-renowned key opinion leader in the eye care industry. He's a professor of optometry at the Aston University. He's been there since the year 2000. His clinical interests vary across cornea, contact lens, ocular surface disease, myopia management, presbyopia, intraocular lenses, and ophthalmic instrument development. He is a national teaching fellow. He has published over 330 full peer-reviewed papers. He's presented and lectured at numerous international conferences and workshops. He's the academic chair of the British Contact Lens Association. He also was the president of the BCLA as well. He's been the chair of several other key workshops and initiatives, such as the BCLA Clear Reports. He's also an executive on the TFM Ocular Surface Society. He's the harmonizer and the subcommittee chair for the TFOS Dues 2 and the TFOS Lifestyle Reports. He is the chief scientific officer for the International Myopia Institute, and he was a joint chair for the white papers for the International Myopia Institute as well. He holds the BCLA medal for 2021 and the American Academy of Optometry Glenn Fry Award for 2022. I mean, I could go on and on. His bio is so long. You never get short of inspired reading his accomplishments. So today we're very proud to have you with us, and we're very privileged that you took out time to speak to us about this important topic. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and you can take it away, Professor James.
Lovely. Thank you so much. And thank you for the kind introduction. So hopefully you can see my screen there. I hope you're all having a good evening and are settled down so we can talk about the digital environment and dry eye, and particularly digital eye strain. So my disclosures are on this slide. So I work with a range of different companies that work with technologies that can impact digital eye strain, and probably one that's most relevant are some of my companies that develop digital devices myself. Okay, so let's think first of all about digital eye strain. Some people call it visual fatigue, other people computer vision syndrome. And we'll have a think when we think about the report in terms of what terminology we should be using, because if we're all using different terminology, that's very confusing for the general public, but also other practitioners. So it's important we think about what terminology is most relevant, and then use that as we talk about this important topic. So first of all, where do we get the definition from? Well, the current definition comes actually from the American Optometric Association, and on their website, which has been much quoted. Computer vision syndrome, also referred to as digital eye strain, describes a group of eye and vision related problems that have resulted from prolonged computer, tablet and cell use. So essentially it is this sort of discomfort that people get from a digital environment. But of course, when we're defining something, we need to be really careful in what we do. Now, traditionally, when we think about discomfort of the eyes, largely we're thinking dry eye, and largely we're thinking about people who are older. But we now know that actually quite a lot of children are also affected by dry eye. So this is a couple of relatively recent papers from our group. The first on 446 children, average age of 13 years. In that group, if we apply the TFOS JUICE2 criteria, which I'll talk about at the end of the lecture, 18% had dry eye. So these are teenagers and people even younger, and yet relatively high prevalence rates of dry eye. And it was associated with screen time, with each hour increasing the odds ratio by 15%. Then in a second study, this time was a study of gamers, so people who spend a lot of time playing games on digital devices. So this was at one of their shows, so quite intense gamers, 456. Now the age range is a bit broader here, but the average age was 24, and there were plenty of children in the sample. Average weekly screen time was 43 hours. Which just seems an amazing amount of time just to spend on screens each week. And 90% of them made the criteria for dry eye symptoms. Poor symptomology was associated again with increased screen use, elevated blink rates, and reduced tear film stability. So a real issue with children, and we need to then think about the future as we move forward. And this is a review paper that Fiona Stapleton has recently put together, and again, really useful for practitioners working in this space. So this looked at all of the evidence that we currently have about dry eye disease in young people, identified a number of papers, a limited number of papers that include this. Prevalence of both symptoms and signs range from 5 to 23%. Symptoms alone, because obviously that's much easier to do in a study, at 5 up to 65%. Risk factors, so we see there digital device use again and duration, but other aspects that tie into that, such as outdoor time, urban living, and ocular allergy and underlying systemic disease. Now, we don't have a good way of treating children yet, when it's specifically for dry eye disease, but generally people apply treatments in a similar way that they would to adults with lifestyle modifications, blinking, management of lid disease, and unpreserved lubricants. Okay, so let's move on to specifically the digital environment. So what sort of symptoms do we typically see? Well, eye dryness, more likely to be blink related, because the blink rate will decrease when people are on these intense tasks, but also, and probably more importantly, we get partial blinking. Also, we can have aspects of accommodative and binocular vision stress. Generally, these screens are relatively close to an individual, so they can report things like blurred vision at near, blurred vision at distance after computer use, difficulty refocusing, and pain in neck and shoulders, and other symptoms that can result from both of those etiologies. So typically here we have eye strain, tired eyes, sensitivity to bright light, and eye discomfort. And researchers have tried to sort of put all of those elements together in some form and relate job demand, job quality, social support, other symptoms, quality of life, and eye symptoms. So it's a complex network of our environment impacting our eyes. So that gives you the setting then for TFOS to run their lifestyle epidemic report on the digital environment. And I know you've been looking at each of these over the last few nights. So this report had a range of experts from around the world. And like the other reports, we looked at the evidence in the literature and tried to summarize the many papers on this topic into a single paper that would then be useful for mainly practitioners, but also researchers, to see where we're up to on this important topic. So what were the goals of the report? Well, as I mentioned earlier, to clarify the terminology relating to ocular effects of the digital environment. And when we think about the digital environment, we'll define that as well. To characterize the differences between the digital environment and the traditional paper environment or real world environment, and the impact this has on the tear film, ocular surface disease, and visual system. To assess the prevalence of the digital environment in terms of its effect on the ocular surface, and also issues of impact on productivity and quality of life. And then to explore the mechanisms of action of the effects of the digital environment on the eyes, and the evidence base for proposed treatments, because there are quite a lot of treatments if you look on any website, and management strategies. And that included our systematic review. You'll have heard of the systematic reviews that were done with each report. So this is the area that we focused our systematic review. So first of all, terminology. A digital environment defined as any technology requiring viewing of a digital display for a cognitive task. So we view lots of digital displays, not really doing any cognitive task. A controller of your TV, that's a digital environment. Sometimes it will have a display on it, but not a heavy digital task. But more importantly, digital eye strain, that was the preferred technology. Computers, well, people don't always think of the smartphone in their pocket as a computer. So digital is a better way, and visual fatigue is a very general term. So we should really be referring to digital eye strain. And that was defined as the development or exacerbation of recurrent ocular symptoms and or signs related specifically to digital device screen viewing. And you'll see when we come and look at things like the prevalence that this is really important. Our current questionnaires only identify that someone has symptoms in a digital environment. It does not identify whether they have the same symptoms in a non-digital environment. So if we want to define digital eye strain, it's important that those symptoms have either got worse or have appeared for the first time, related specifically to that digital device screen viewing. Now, when we come to digital devices, there are many aspects of those devices. First is the type. So we've moved on from cathode ray tubes, which were large and essentially had phosphors that were simulated, to flat screen technology. But even within flat screen technology, there's different technology within that. So liquid crystal displays, background technology, these organic light emitting diodes, and electronic paper. And there is good evidence to suggest that symptoms are lower with electronic paper than they are with other forms of digital display. And it's not just the technology itself, it's also characteristics of that technology and its use. So the light that it emits, the screen size, position and resolution, refresh rate, viewing distance, brightness and contrast all contribute to the impact of that visual environment. And also we can't forget things like virtual and augmented reality. And again, when it comes to virtual and augmented reality, the research suggests that this environment is actually better for the ocular surface. And the thinking here is, despite the close distance of the screen, actually you've captured the environment, the humidity around the eyes, and that helps reduce symptoms. However, there are limited papers in that area. So what about prevalence? What about other types of aspects of usage? Well, we've spoken already about screen distance, resolution, refresh rate, and size. And you can see here in the report, taken from the report, sort of typical type aspects for each of those. So smart watches and handheld consoles and smartphones are held the closest away. Obviously, television can be a digital device, particularly if you're playing a game, for example, with a controller connected to your TV. That's a much further viewing distance. Refresh rates again vary very dramatically, as does resolution, and these things are improving all the time, but sometimes an improvement in resolution can be challenging for the visual system because it means that more detail is packed into the screen. So what about the epidemiology of dry eye? So if we look at the studies that have done, and there are quite a number of them, in terms of reporting the prevalence of dry eye, it ranges from 39% in bank workers in Italy to 97.3% in university in Saudi Arabia. The average being around sort of 70%. So very high, but you can see from what I said before, if we're just determining that they have symptoms when they're using a digital device, that's probably people also who have other conditions such as just general dry eye. So the diagnostic criteria most commonly based on the CVSQ, which we'll look at in a moment, but also many people just using their own custom survey. Reasonably large surveys, and you can see there the prevalence rate. So we've got some countries in Africa that have been covered. You can see Ethiopia and Ghana, for example, in this part of the table. And if we go down, you'll see some other areas as well and their rates, but relatively similar. So on average, around 70%. So let's have a look at the most common of those questionnaires. So this is the CVSQ. So you can see that it's essentially split into two parts, initially on frequency and then on intensity. Obviously, if the frequency is never, you don't need to fill in the intensity. And there are 16 different symptoms that they get you to rate, from burning all the way through to headaches. So if you never have it, you don't need to score it. If you occasionally have it, it gets a score of 1. If you often or always have it, you have a score of 2. And if you experience that particular symptom, so occasionally or often or always, you also need to give it an intensity score as moderate, which is scored as 1, or intense, scored as 2. And then you multiply those two numbers together. So let's say in this case, I have feeling that the sight is worsening, and I think that that's often or always. That gets a score of 2. But I think that that's only a moderate intensity. That's a 1. So I multiply those together and I get 2. So I want this to be a little bit interactive, even though you're a long way away. So I want you just to spend a couple of minutes going through those symptoms yourself. And for those that you feel that you get when you're using a digital screen, give a score, either occasionally or often, and the moderate intensity, etc. And I think you should be able to pop that into the chat, and we can have a look then at the sorts of values that we're getting. So just a couple of minutes to do that for yourself. Okay, hopefully you've had the time to do that. It's not coming through in my chat, but hopefully that's given you a little feel about how to use these questionnaires. Okay, so what about the diagnosis then of digital eye strain? Well, at the moment, it's based on symptomology. And as you've seen, the questionnaires use things like frequency and severity. There's no criteria in these questionnaires to link it only to digital device use. And potentially you could have one or two symptoms and meet the cutoff. The cutoff for the CVSQ is 6. So just 2 symptoms potentially could lead to a diagnosis. Yeah, in terms of the CVSQ, it was just for your own information. You don't need to send anything in. So what kind of symptoms? Well, you've seen the sorts of symptoms that it asks about. So burning, eye pain, headaches, eye redness, photophobia, tearing, foreign body sensation. So a high range of symptoms. So there's no real gold standard to compare this to when you're developing a questionnaire, and only 2 of the questionnaires that have been developed. So that's the CVSQ and also this computer vision syndrome scale, CVSS17, with 17 items, but a bit more variable in terms of its response categories, have been rash analyzed. So that means that they've been validated and scaled. But the big problem there is they haven't really done item reduction. So we really don't know what the most important symptoms are, which ones correlate together, which are the sort of key ones that tell us about what should be rated. But it's the best that we've got at the moment. Okay, so let's have a look. We've looked at the symptoms, but let's have a look at objective signs as well. So what sort of things change or have been reported to possibly be diagnostic of digital eye strain? Well, first of all, we have blink rate and completeness. We know that there's a dramatic reduction in blink rate with computer use. And this is relevant to the dry eye symptoms that frequently occur in dry eye disease. We also know that incomplete blinking occurs more with digital screen use, and that's most likely to be tied in to the symptoms that people report. The second aspect that people have looked at is critical flicker fusion frequency. So generally, our ability to detect flicker decreases as we strain our eyes. So there are changes that happen and people then start to complain and feel pain and itching around their eyes. However, while some studies have shown a link between CFF and digital device use, other studies have found no correlation with symptoms, but maybe that's because those were perhaps the shorter studies. What about accommodation and vergence function? Quite often these screens are very close, so they might put a strain on our eyes. People have found little, if any, increased lag of accommodation between digital and paper use, nor in things like accommodated microfluctuations or our ability to overcome targets put at different distances, so accommodative facility. And there are no differences in vergence function between individuals involved in computer work and those not in computer work. So we're not really finding anything relating to accommodation or vergence function. Another thing that people have looked at are pupil dynamics. We know that the pupil can be affected by a whole load of factors, but one of them is more demanding tasks. Overall increase in pupil size during 20-minute tasks was reported in one paper, reduced pupil diameter and increased amplitude of pupillary reflex in another. So again, we're not getting really clear signs that relate to digital eye strain. So certainly for the moment, digital eye strain is mainly diagnosed based on symptoms alone. So the next part of the paper really looked at the sort of mechanisms involved with digital eye strain. So here are sort of infographic from that. So there are a whole load of inciting factors. These are some of the ones that we mentioned earlier. So device characteristics, such as its digital device styles, screen resolution, contrast, some of them more adjustable, like lighting, the actual distance it is away from you. The intensity of the activity is clearly important. So the higher the cognitive demand, generally the more symptoms that we get. And also there are a whole load of compounding factors, such as the coexistence of dry eye or other eye diseases, age, sex, some of the risk factors for dry eye, such as sleep time and environment. So all of those factors, based on the individual device that you're then using, can cause changes to the ocular surface exposure. And this is largely through blinking, or visual and accommodative system. And this is largely to do with the distance that the task is away and the demand, but also other alterations, ergonomics. So particularly our position when we're holding a digital device tends to change, and that can put strain on our neck and our back, and general lighting conditions as well. So that then leads to alterations of the ocular surface, pretty much all of the layers of the tear film, inflammation in the form of conjunctival redness, etc. And those will lead then to the visual disturbances that we see for the ocular surface, for the accommodative and vergent system, but also our general posture. And those then lead to our symptoms, and people have tried to divide up those symptoms into those that are more related to the ocular surface, such as dryness and discomfort, those that are more related to visual and ocular motor systems, such as blurred vision, and then finally those that are more related to our posture, such as neck, shoulder and back pain, headaches and glare. But you can see that there's some overlap. Glare, for example, appears both with those extraocular symptoms, but also in terms of the ocular surface. The report goes on then to look at productivity, and there's clear evidence that if you're suffering from digital eye strain, that will impact ocular symptoms, visual systems, musculoskeletal symptoms, and then impact other things related to that, such as quality of life. The other thing that the report looked at in some detail was around COVID-19 and its impact on the eyes. Of course, people generally went a lot more digital, but they also changed their environment. But the number of people reporting symptoms quite dramatically increased. And that was largely put down to the move to digital schooling and remote working. So let's now start to think towards treatments. So our systematic review for this report had the question, which I think is top of my mind, but I imagine many of you as clinicians, which ocular surface disease management approaches reduce symptoms associated with digital device use? And like is often the case in your first search, that identified many papers, but when you rationalize those down to randomized controlled trials, so those trials where we're comparing things compared to a placebo type environment, then we limit it to only 35 trials. And you can see those in the table here. And so a range of trials, relatively small trials on average, but looking at various aspects such as antioxidant supplement interventions, probiotics, omega-3 fatty acids and supplementation, combined omega-3 and antioxidants, blue light blocking interventions, topical lubricant drops, blink reminders and interventions, rest break promotion, and then display type interventions, so changing the display, humidifiers, eyelid warming interventions, and then these other adjunct therapies. So a reasonable number of different approaches have been examined to try and see whether they have an impact on digital eye strain. You will have seen these. These are bias tables, so these check the design of the study. and identify areas where there might be risk of bias. So we don't have any sort of, well, we have maybe one perfect study, but most have some elements where perhaps they could have done a little better. But it does show that we do have a good range of studies looking at some of these topic areas. So in terms of the studies and our ability to put them together, most of them don't report data in a similar way where they can be put together. However, there were 4 areas where we could do that. So there was 3 studies relating to blue light blocking, which was similar enough, sorry, a couple of studies on blue light blocking that were similar enough that we could put them together. And you can see here the standardized mean difference, that star beneath really shows no effect. Blink reminders, again, a couple of studies. Those are to the left of the line, so they're showing a positive effect, as is the studies that we can put together on omega-3 supplementation. But the other area that we had multiple studies was antioxidant supplements, and the majority of studies there, again, cross that midline, suggesting that there's no overall effect. When we look at the studies overall, there are quite a lot of studies, 10 studies on antioxidants, which have often been promoted for digital eye strain. But you can see there in terms of those studies, actually, they are showing no overall effect on pretty much all of the aspects that they look at, such as eye strain, dryness, itching, watering, redness, blurring of vision, maybe a slight effect on glare. When it comes to blue light, again, this is often advocated as a solution for digital eye strain. But actually, if we look at the studies, and there have been 4 studies on blue light, as you can see here, then in terms of eye strain and fatigue, no, it crosses the midline. There is no benefit of blue light therapies on digital eye strain. Same for blurring of vision and same for glare. So these therapies, while they've often been pushed in the literature, actually there is evidence base for them, and it suggests that they are not effective. So how do we manage someone who approaches us reporting eye strain when they're using digital devices? Well, we've got to be careful, first of all, to do a differential diagnosis, because this could be something else. It could be dry eye, it could be an infection, it could be allergy. So for digital eye strain, we're expecting it to be bilateral, no discharge. The vision shouldn't be affected, particularly in the sort of longer term. It might be affected in between blinks. It should be discomfort rather than pain. And if any contact lenses are worn, then it's important to optimize those. In terms of our assessment, when we're going to look at the tear film, and we'll talk about how we do that in a moment, binocular vision and refraction are all very important. And essentially, if any of those are affected, we need to manage those in the normal way. And so the TFOS used 2 reports talk to us about how we manage dry eye. Ocular motor management, again, is something familiar in our skill sets, and the patient needs to be fully corrected, ideally for the distance that they're using, but corrections, so spectacle correction specific for digital eye strain, really haven't shown much benefit in the literature. So now we've done our differential diagnosis and our normal assessment, then if they still have signs of digital eye strain, the most likely treatment that's going to get benefit from what we understand to date is omega-3 supplementation. So that's well worth considering. There's some treatments that have been shown to be effective, but we certainly need more studies on it. So there's a little bit of controversy. So these are things like refractive correction appropriate to screen distance, blinking, so regular blink reminders and taking break reminders seems to work. Ergonomics, so avoiding reflections on screen and placing the screen slightly lower than the eyes, so we decrease the interpalpebral aperture. Devices, so increase screen size and font, switching to e-paper or a virtual reality environment, environmental conditions, so increasing humidity and decreasing air conditioning, and then tasks, so limiting screen use to 4 to 5 hours per day and making it less cognitively demanding. What is unlikely to have any benefit, and we have evidence to show that it doesn't seem to, are blue light blocking, antioxidants, parabiotics, and these progressive addition computer spectacles. So again, those are things that we shouldn't be promoting with our patients, and when they report to us that they've seen various adverts on websites, we can let them know that these have been found not to be effective. However, there remain some areas where there's limited research in things like oculomotor exercises, dry eye treatments. So while dry eye treatments, of course, are very effective for dry eye, relatively few of them have been tested specifically on digital eye strain. People have also tried things like yoga and traditional medication, but they're limited research in that area. So hopefully that gives you a good feel for what was reported in the TFOS Lifestyle report on digital eye strain. But of course, dry eye management is a really important part of that. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about that and how that impacts what we do. So the TFOS Jews reports, those are getting a little bit older now, 2017, but there's still a lot of wisdom in them. And many of you will be aware we've just started the work towards TFOS Jews 3. So we'll see the update in 2025, but we're not expecting big changes in terms of certainly things like the definition and diagnosis side of things. So within that report, dry eye was defined as a multifactorial disease of the ocular surface characterized by that loss of homeostasis of the tear film, that balance of the tear film, accompanied by ocular symptoms. So ocular symptoms always need to be there, otherwise it's just the more general term of ocular surface disease. But when you get damage to the tear film and ocular surface and you get ocular symptoms, then it's dry eye if it's caused by tear film instability, hyperosmolarity, inflammation and damage, and the neurosensory abnormalities that play these etiological roles. And when it comes then to our management, of course, we're always going to do a history and symptoms. And just like digital eye strain, we're going to look at those potential triaging questions, hopefully very common to us and a natural part of our history and symptoms. But it's not just optometrists and ophthalmologists that look at people with dry eye. It's also pharmacists and GPs. So it's helpful for them to have these additional questions to help them. And then also risk factors. So this is where we're looking at some of those factors which might cause dryness. And this is where digital screens also comes into your questioning. So you can find out some information such as what kind of screens they use, what sort of distances do they use them, and that will help with your mitigations afterwards. But in terms of your diagnostic tests, specifically for dry eye, we do have some questionnaires, and TFOS Jews 2 recommended 2 of those. So the DQ5 or the OSDI giving us cutoffs for those. And again, we could add to that a question about whether those symptoms increase or some of them specifically happen only in a digital environment, which would help to give us certainty about whether there's a digital eye strain element to that. And then in terms of our homeostasis markers, and again, we're going to use these on our digital eye strain reporting patients, because this tells us whether the tear film and dry eye is the principal component. We're going to do non-invasive testing. So this is ideally our non-invasive breakup time. If you don't have anything else, you can use fluorescein, but of course you're changing the chemical composition and the volume of liquid on the ocular surface, so putting the minimal amount into the eye is important. Osmolarity is there if you have it, because it's one of the pathophysiologies of dry eye. but you only need one of these three items, and the other one being ocular surface staining, not just with fluorescein of the cornea, but also ideally lissamine green, looking at the conjunctiva and the lid margin. And from that, if you're diagnosing them with dry eye, then we go on to our subclassification into evaporative and aqueous deficiency. And this is something that we're working on specifically within TFOS DUES 3, and then on to the different managements. But one of the issues with the different managements is that we know how well a management performs compared to a placebo, but we don't have many trials comparing different treatments to each other. So this is where the survey that you were all sent and can be reached at this QR code, if you haven't filled it out already, comes in to be important, because this fills in the gaps between what people are doing in practice and the limited research evidence that we have. So we only have a limited number of people from Africa who filled it in so far. We have over 1,000 responses worldwide. So it's really important that Africa is truly represented. So I would really encourage you to spend the 15 minutes or so just telling us how you currently diagnose dry eye and your management options. When you open it up, it looks like a reasonably big table, but you only need to fill in the bits that you actually do. So it should be relatively quick to fill in. So I'd really encourage you, if you haven't done already, just download that QR code. And this is something that if you can fill it in the next couple of days, that would be really gratefully received, and make sure that Africa is on the map in terms of practitioners and how they manage dry eye. So we did do this a number of years ago, in fact, at the time of TFOS DUES 2, and this publication looked at all of the different treatments that people reported using, and what kind of severity the patient had to have for them to use it, what subtype of the disease. And so you can see a whole range of treatments, and that will be even larger this time because more treatments have come onto the market. But what was good to see is that actually, if we just take the sort of more basic treatments that we think of, so things like advice, fatty acids, so your omega-3, artificial tears, ointments, lid hygiene, warm compresses, actually the vast majority of the severity of the disease and subtypes was covered. So I think that that's really useful in terms of sort of understanding how people are using these management options at the moment. The other thing that we've introduced more recently, and again ties into digital eye strain, is the interactive dry eye wheel. So that can be reached at the World Council of Optometry website, which the QR code links directly to. And this was developed with my good colleagues, Jennifer Craig, who I'm in New Zealand with currently from the University of Auckland, and Lyndon Jones, who will be very familiar to you from the University of Waterloo in Canada. So this simplifies dry eye in terms of things that we do for mitigation, the things that we do for measurement, and those that we do for management. And it starts with the outer wheel, the bronze wheel, with things that you can do with no specialist equipment at all. Then moving into the silver wheel, which is for more eye care specialists such as yourselves, with access to a slit lamp. And then finally, some more sort of advanced skills that take a little bit more training and time in the inner wheel. So I'd really encourage you to engage with that as well, making sure then that you can implement this in practice for all of your patients. And as you saw from prevalence, many of those patients will have digital eye strain to help them in sort of managing their everyday life and seeing just the importance of caring and looking after their eyes. And you can see there under mitigation in the outer wheel is eye strain. So this is something that you can help people to manage with no specialist equipment whatsoever, in asking those questions. And when you pick up that this exists, doing that differential diagnosis, trying to ascertain whether this is digital eye strain or something such as allergy or infection, and then recommending evidence-based treatments. So that brings me towards the end of my lecture time with you. Just to remind you that all of the articles, and I know you've studied many of these already, are freely available in the Ocular Surface journal. And it's really useful if you want to find out a little bit more information about anything that any of the speakers have said, to go to those reports. They're nicely broken up into sections, so you can easily search for your question to see exactly how it was addressed, what evidence that we currently have to improve your conversations with your patients. It leaves me to thank particularly David Sullivan, who is behind all of these reports in terms of the organizer, Jennifer Craig, who was the chair of these reports, and helped by Monica Alves as the vice chair, Amy Sullivan, who helps make sure that we can actually deliver these reports, and then the steering committee of TFOS from a range of different countries who make sure that we continually pull the evidence together, that we promote new evidence being generated, but also the dissemination of that evidence to practitioners to improve the practice that they can give to their patients, so their patients can optimize their quality of life. So thank you so much for your attention. I did see some questions coming through, so we can have a look at those now together, and I shall hand back to the organisers.
All right, thank you so much, Professor James. This was really interesting. So we have some questions in the chat section, so I'll read them out and then you just give answers to them. So the first question is something that I knew or I was expecting. As soon as you mentioned blue blocking lenses, everybody goes haywire. I have had a couple of arguments with colleagues as to why I do not prescribe them or why I do not feel they work, because there's no evidence supporting that they do. It's more commercial. But from the question, says, did the speaker say blue cut lenses, progressive addition lenses, and eye antioxidants do not help digital eye strain? Please throw more light on this.
Yes. So obviously when a new technology comes, people will start to promote it. But that's why we do the science, to see whether that's a real effect. And of course, with many of these things, there's a psychological aspect, and we all know about the placebo effect. So often people feel that something's helping them, they will report less symptoms. So it's not just that we don't have any evidence for blue blocking, it's quite the contrary now. Actually, we have plenty of evidence because people have tried to prove that their blue light blocking product works. But when that is done without bias, so it's randomized, the investigator is masked. It's obviously difficult to mask the patient with blue light blocking. Actually, in terms of what we can measure, so both in terms of signs and symptoms, there aren't benefits. So it's important then as practitioners, we take that on board and we move forward from the advice. There are still plenty of websites, of course, pushing blue blocking for digital eye strain, but we as practitioners need to work on the evidence. Now, that's not to say that blue light couldn't be beneficial, blocking couldn't be beneficial for other things, such as, we know blue light is involved in more scatter. So if you wear blue light blocking glasses, you're probably going to get less glare. But when we're talking about digital eye strain, then the answer is this is not a product that has been shown to help in this technology. That's the same for antioxidants. You saw there were even more studies on antioxidants for digital eye strain. Again, the research, whether we're looking at symptoms, whether we're looking at signs, shows that systematically they do not help. There's less evidence when it comes to what they call computer glasses. That's not to say that correction for the distance that someone's using is not important. So your progressive lens, if people are using an intermediate distance to their screen, yes, that is important. But what we're saying here is if people have designed specific computer vision glasses and compared them to normal glasses, the evidence at the moment shows that there is no great benefit.
Yep.
So it is the commercial side rather than the other side.
True. Agreed. Thank you so much for that. So I think this goes back to the level of evidence. So if a participant wants to know, when you say it is a treatment option is unlikely to yield any result, what do you mean by that? So I guess that goes back to the evidence for it.
Yes. So unlikely. So these are strategies that have research papers, good quality research papers published for them, but found no effect. So that would suggest that essentially they are unlikely, possibly not at all, going to give a benefit. Now, obviously, more research can be done in the future, and that's why we say unlikely rather than definitely not. But certainly it would not be worth, if I was the patient, I would want to know that it's not worth investing my money in that kind of technology, because the research evidence shows that it is not beneficial, or has not been able to show that it's beneficial.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the next question is, how often is there meibomian gland dysfunction in digital screen users?
That's a very good question, and the answer is it will be very common. And what we don't have at the moment is a good differentiator between dry eye and digital eye strain. You can see all of those studies that looked at prevalence basically used a questionnaire, so they didn't look at ocular surface damage. And in just doing a questionnaire, they didn't generally differentiate between symptoms that happen all of the time, i.e. dry eye disease, and those that happen specifically with a computer. But you can imagine if you've got meibomian gland disease, it's going to disrupt your tear film, cause inflammation, in which case you are likely to be uncomfortable when you use a digital device. And when we use a digital device, we blink less, and that's largely likely to increase symptomology, which then is digital eye strain. So in your patients who report digital eye strain, it's very important to have a look at their meibomian glands, but the likelihood of them having meibomian gland dysfunction is very high.
Thank you very much for that. Your answer reminded me of a paper I discussed with an intern a couple of years ago, where digital device users underwent mammography, and they compared those who had digital eye strain with the mammography, and noticed there was more meibomian gland loss in individuals who complain more of digital eye strain. So I think that further reinforces or gives evidence to your answer.
Yeah.
So the next question is, several researchers or researchers have suggested alteration in the tear film and ocular surface through digital device use. The relationship may be melatoninogen, I guess due to melatonin activity on the ocular surface and blue light. So I guess this is sort of giving credence to why we may use blue blocking lenses in the sense that maybe digital device use affects melatonin secretion, and melatonin cutting out the blue lights may decrease that melatonin level, and maybe may have some improvement in digital eye strain. Are you aware of any such thing?
Yeah, so we know that melatonin levels are affected by some blue light, but again, we've got to be really careful. Blue is quite a broad band, and towards the top end, so towards 450 odd nanometers, well, above 450 nanometers, that's the part that affects the melatonin, not the lower levels. And again, we know that if you've got poor sleep, that can cause, is one of the risk factors for dry eye. So certainly if you're disrupting your melatonin relationship, then that could cause disruption to your tear film, cause symptoms. However, that's not what we're seeing when the products are tested. So it is clear that that is not working in terms of mechanism. It might be that the products are not yet optimized to
Okay.
allow you to affect your sleep patterns. And certainly I would be recommending people not to use their digital devices in the half an hour or so before they go to sleep, because that can impact you. But again, is that the blue light coming from the screen? Is that just that you've put a high cognitive demand now in your head when it's trying to settle down for sleep? We don't have the evidence for that. So that's where we need to come back to randomized controlled trials, and the randomized controlled trials show that it doesn't work. So whatever you think the mechanism might be, essentially promoting products that are blue blocking on the bounds that they will improve digital eye strain is incorrect. And in fact, there is a company in the UK that promoted that very heavily and received some rather large fines from the government because they weren't
I read about that.
using the evidence. Yes. So practitioners have to be careful. We do have to go on the evidence. That's why people come to us. Otherwise, they could just get their information off the web, and we would be redundant.
Yep. Again, your answer makes me think of something. I mean, most modern digital devices these days have the option of cutting out blue light towards the evening or going towards night mode. And it makes you compare if your digital device already does that, do you actually need a pair of glasses specifically to do the same thing? And what studies would how would using one versus the other impact digital eye strain? So that might be something interesting to study.
Yeah, so there are some papers that look at these filters and their impact. And the answer is, in terms of digital eye strain, they don't have an impact. It may be that they have an impact on sleep quality. That's not something that the report looks at.
Yeah. All right. So the next question, okay, I'll take this one at a time. So can you throw more light on blink reminders and its potency in managing digital eye strain?
Yeah, so there are a couple of studies that have looked at the what we call the 20-20-20 rule, to this idea that people should regularly look away from the screen far away, and others that have looked at whether reminding people to do a blink, so particularly sort of closing eyes, squeezing eyes, opening eyes, will be beneficial. Some of these are just in dry eye, some of them are specific to digital eye strain. But it would seem if you can get people to take those regular breaks, and ideally in those regular breaks to do some additional blinking to make sure that they really are fully closing their eyes, that you do get benefits. But it's in that sort of likely category because we don't have lots of good randomized controlled trials yet, but the evidence that we have point to it being of benefit.
Thank you for that. So the next question is, as optometrists, what can we do in order to protect the future of our children or the next generation? I mean, this is against the backdrop that there's an increase in digital device use. I mean, that's been linked to maybe contributing to the myopia prevalence that we now see. So what can we do as optometrists to protect the eyes of the future kids?
Yeah, so the two things we're seeing, so obviously kids reporting symptoms when they use their digital devices. That's a bit of a trigger for a more of a dry eye type assessment, a normal dry eye treatment. But the other thing that we often see is meibomian gland damage, even in those who aren't yet symptomatic. So if you can look at those glands, even if it's just at the lower lid, that's a good talking point with the parents about the possible damage that can be done. And actually, if we're going to put strains on our eyes by these devices, we should think probably a bit more like a dentist. So when you go and see a dentist, yes, they will inspect your teeth and clean them up, but they require you then to brush your teeth every day before you come back and see them. So it may be that actually with children's vision, if we're going to stress it so much, that we should be thinking about prescribing warm compresses and artificial tears to make sure that the ocular surface has minimum effect from the strain that we're putting it on. It's very difficult to stop children from using digital devices, and many schools and stuff now use them. So it probably is more than about the prophylaxis.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that, and I totally agree. So the next question looks at I mean, we sort of have dwelled a lot about what's unlikely to work in digital eye strain. So what are the treatment options that have been proven to be effective in managing digital eye strain?
So the main one where we have good research evidence is omega-3. So omega-3 supplementation, while there have been papers in the sort of dry eye field that have questioned it, to the Blink study, essentially with that the control was castor oil, so that actually is fairly effective, and people are now
Yeah,
using it for treatment. So it probably was that sort of downplayed it, but the systematic reviews still say that omega-3 is beneficial in dry eye, and the research that's specific to digital eye strain, where there have been a number of papers, again consistently show a benefit. So that is something that we should be talking to our patients about.
yeah, totally agree. I mean, especially with the Blink study placebo effect. I
Yeah.
think that was more of comparison of two treatments as against placebo.
Yeah.
Um,
And I'd
so
encourage people to have a look at the nutrition report, because the
exactly,
nutrition report then talks about the different
castor oil.
omega-3s and the benefits of the fish oils over plant oils and stuff like that. So that will give you a bit more guidance in terms of the actual products
Yeah,
to
exactly.
recommend.
We had Barbara
Ah,
talk to us
fantastic. Yeah.
about that. Yeah, and I mean, we talked about the Mediterranean diet, and it brings you back to the omega-3s at the end of the day.
It does.
So the next question is how does digital eye strain relate to refractive errors? I'm going to take a leap here and think that that's referring to uncorrected refractive errors. So,
Yeah, so we know that if you're trying to stare at a task and it's blurry for you, or you're having to over accommodate because you're not at that right distance, right refraction, will cause eye strain if you're doing things for a long time. You could take the analogy of holding a book in your hand for several hours because you're having to use those muscles. It's exactly the same for eyes and accommodation. So while the accommodation and verdant system is pretty robust, it's best to have the patient fully corrected. So again, this is where coming and seeing their optometrist and making sure that they have an optimum refraction is important.
yeah, thank you for that. Your answer makes me think of something that came to my mind while you were presenting. A lot of times we may see patients with multiple issues that contributes to ocular surface disease. We could have a patient who has contact lens discomfort and maybe experiencing digital eye strain and maybe has dry eye disease, which may or may not be have induced by the contact lens. So how do you separate them? How do you manage them? How do you optimize contact lens comfort in such a patient who also may have digital eye strain?
Yeah. So I would always start with the contact lens. So there are many new contact lens technologies, particularly surface technologies, water gradients, those sorts of things that can improve the comfort of an individual. And we now know that the main driver of discomfort is the lubricity, the slippiness of the surface. So if we can improve that, and there are many different brands down that path, then that's the best thing to do first of all. So get the contact lens as good as we can. The contact lens should actually give us some protection of the ocular surface if we optimize that. Next, I would focus on the dry eye. And of course, we have many dry eye managements and good reports that explain to us how best to do that. And we can then think about the digital environment if that is causing additional symptoms. And that's where we can think about how we manage that over the top. But to be honest, if you're managing the dry eye well, omega-3 is part of that, as are many of the issues around blinking. Then the sort of rest of the likely managements for digital eye strain are about the technology. So it is then about having a larger screen size and making sure that the environment is optimized.
So interesting, I mean, we're starting off with the contact lenses first, and interesting, you didn't go to supplementing tears or artificial tears first of all, because I mean, as practitioners, the first thing a contact lens patient comes in with dryness, the first thing we grab a bottle of preservative-free artificial tears and we yank it and say, take that. But we should actually be looking at the chemistry or the properties of the contact lenses themselves. I mean, I was fortunate to be part of the AAO Cochrane group where we looked at contact lens discomfort, led by Barbara and Andrew Parker. And I mean, we didn't really find such a difference between preserved versus preservative-free tears with dry eye contact lens-induced discomfort. But in your experience, or from what is published out there, do you think preservative versus preservative-free drops may help in digital eye strain?
We certainly know that many patients react to preservatives. This mainly comes from things like the glaucoma literature, where people are using drops multiple times a day. And I would always start with what we've done to the eye. So, in glaucoma, you're using a medication. So I would be looking at that medication and optimizing it, and then think about other things that we could do for the ocular surface. Same for someone who's on a medication that potentially has dry eye effects. We need to think first of all about the medication. Is that the right medication for them? That might be a discussion with another health professional, because obviously if we can have something that's gentle on the ocular surface, that's the optimum. But if we can't, because otherwise they're going to die of heart disease, then obviously we need to mitigate for that by managing the ocular surface. And normally it's a combination of the two. So while we're optimizing the contact lens, we might use some artificial tears, but our idea would be to get the contact lens into a state that they don't have to use artificial tears or only occasionally have to use them.
And I mean, I would assume, there's also literature for the fact that daily disposables or switching to a frequent replacement modality would also be beneficial as well.
Absolutely, yes.
So my next question before I go back to the audience is, you did touch on in your diagram where you talked about testing for digital eye strain or the effect it has on the ocular surface. You touched on use of sodium fluorescein on the eyes, but also mentioned how this may impact tear volume. I'm currently working with a group where we're trying to design a protocol, and I keep going back and forth with how much fluorescein should we use? Should we be using the strips? Should we divide the strips into two? How can we, I know the TFOS diagnostic report touched on some of the diagnostic tests, but what would you say would be the best way to use fluorescein for checking the tear breakup time while minimizing the effect or the impact on tear volume?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is ideally we wouldn't be using fluorescein at all. So if we can, and there are many cheaper alternatives now to look at a non-invasive breakup time. So I think we really should be encouraging practitioners to try and do that, particularly if they're serious about dry eye. Because if you think about the tear film, a tenth of the thickness of a human hair, and we're now sticking a great big wodge of paper in with a chemical composition that's different and tear volume. If you have to use fluorescein, the important thing is really the minimum amount. A paper strip is fine, but you do need to flick off the excess saline, and you want to put it as remotely on the eye, so on the sort of outer canthus, so it doesn't affect any of the sort of areas that we're looking at. So obviously we put fluorescein in for staining, but ideally we would assess the tear film in a different way.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. The next question goes, are there any studies that correlates the hours spent on digital devices and the magnitude of digital eye strain?
Repeat the question.
Are there any studies that correlates the number of hours spent on digital devices with the magnitude of digital eye strain?
Yeah, so there are several studies. I mean, the difficulty with those sorts of studies is obviously getting people to report how many hours they actually do, and we know that they're not always accurate on that. But it would seem that people who use digital devices for more than 4 to 5 hours a day have a higher risk factor of digital eye strain, and there are quite a few studies in that sort of 4 to 5 type cutoff. But obviously, people's work is people's work. If they have an option, it's not normally a modifiable factor that they can choose not to use digital devices. We're all staring at a digital screen at the moment as we do this lecture. So to me, that's something that's useful for them to know, that if they have a job that requires a lot of digital use, then they are more likely to have eye strain, and that might explain why they do. But then I'm looking for those modifiable factors such as blinking, such as omega-3, etc., that's going to make their life easier.
Yeah. So the last question for the day looks at the DEQ5 questionnaire. So a lot of the questions in the questionnaire sort of are in relation to the last 2 hours before bed. So is sleep pattern or sleep cycle in a way related to digital eye strain? Does this have any place in its management, in its diagnosis, or the differential diagnosis?
So no one's specifically really looked at that area. They've just looked at digital devices as a whole. Yes, and we know that people get drier eyes at the end of the day, and that's sort of regardless, from the contact lens studies, it's sort of regardless of whether you refresh the lens, etc. So the eyes clearly are more susceptible to dryness and symptoms at the end of the day. How much of that specifically related to digital devices, we don't know. And the other problem we have now is that digital device use has become so common that people are rarely doing equivalent paper tasks. So it's difficult to do those studies where you compare those aspects. But certainly, to me, it's more about if they're getting those symptoms, particularly if they're specific to when they're on a digital device, then working through the checking the dry eye status of their eyes, making sure you've got an optimum refraction, checking whether there's any binocular vision abnormality, as we would as optometrists, and then applying the appropriate management therapies.
Thank you so much for that. And it's been a real pleasure having you, Professor James. Thank you so much for taking out the time to teach us and enlighten us about the TFOS lifestyle impact of digital environment on the ocular surface. Just as a reminder, the TFOS Dews 3 conference is coming up in Venice, Italy. If you are interested, please do well to attend. It promises to be very exciting and educating. As Professor James has stressed today, the TFOS dry practice surveys we've been sending out. Please take out 10 minutes, 15 minutes and fill the survey, because we have information from all parts of the world and we have very limited information from Africa. So the links will be sent out by CFI today. When you get the emails, when you get the links, please do well to fill them, because that information helps us form policies and educative programs on how for different regions of the world, and it'd be important to have the African voice heard in that survey. Again, the recordings for the webinars will be made available on the iAfrica Media platform. You get the links after the webinar series. If you'd like to contact Professor James and ask more questions, or if you'd like to reach out to me and ask more questions about what's been presented today, please feel free to do so. Once again, thank you so much, Professor James, for taking out the time. It's been a real pleasure, and this has been really, really enlightening. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.